never reach 5,000 naira. Okada mewa, 10 Okada. It never reach 1 million. Minimum wage rate that they ask, 10 workers for 1 year, never reach 1 million.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this event today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. We have a truly international gathering today, so we have people tuning in from all around the world. We are very excited to have you joining us for today's event on Sudan and Congo. I just wanted to start with an introduction, and then we'll go over a little bit of the background for how this event came to be, introduce our illustrious speakers, our panelists, who are joining us today to provide additional information and context, and also to make sure that we can engage in a lively discussion. So again, thank you all for joining. My name is Amara Enyia. I am the president of Global Black. We are a transnational advocacy organization. We have done work on many of the key issues facing Africans and people of African descent around the world. And so our work is geared toward collaborating with our people wherever they are, connecting, learning, and advocacy on a number of policy issues, really the most relevant issues that we face. And so our goal with this event is really to follow on the tradition of making sure that we are, that we as Africans, people of African descent, are at the forefront of not only articulating the challenges that we face, but also what the solutions should be, what the solutions could be, and how we can actually work together, build together, which is our primary goal and our primary responsibility. So we're extremely excited to have all of you joining us. If you could let us know from where you are calling from. I see in the chat, folks are already dropping into the chat. There are folks in Panama. And yes, I will have to say, so for today's discussion, we have translation in Arabic and French, Sudanese, Arabic, and French. And I'm not sure, but we can see if we can make some adjustments to have translation also in Spanish, particularly for those who are joining us for Spanish speakers who are joining us. If you are able to look at the bottom of the screen, if you do require interpretation services, there's a button at the bottom. It looks like a little globe. You can click on that and you can select the appropriate language for you. We also have a Q&A box that's at the bottom of the screen as well. And we do want to get your questions throughout this event. So if you do have questions, feel free to drop the questions into the Q&A box. You can also use the chat feature. And so again, for those who are joining us, if you can drop your name and drop where you're viewing this webinar from, that'd be great, just to give us a sense of where people are joining us, from where people are joining us. So we have a really exciting conversation. I want to introduce our speakers who will be diving into this issue of Sudan and Congo and really putting into context what has not been perhaps as visible in the media, in the news, depending upon where you are. And so we thought that it was important for us to, one, make more visible these issues, the crises there, also providing more of the background and the historical context to those crises so that it can inform how they are to be addressed and inform both our understanding, but also we will have calls to action toward the end of this discussion that will hopefully activate people to getting involved in the ways that make sense for you. And so that is the impetus for this conversation, and it is our goal. Again, I want to ask our team for more information. We'll be dropping links, helpful links into the chat for people to be able to follow up. We have a number of organizations that are represented. I also wanted to, we'll go into longer introductions, but I do want to just state before we do just a brief presentation that we're joined today by Quscondy Abdulshafi, who is the Senior Regional Advisor for Africa for Freedom House. We also have with us Dr. Suliman Baldo, who is the founding director of the Sudan Transparency and Policy Tracker, and also brings extensive expertise from Congo. And then last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Eva Kahir, who is a medical doctor and humanitarian, a Sudanese medical doctor and humanitarian. And so these are our panelists that we will be speaking with. So before we dive into the conversation, I wanted to take a minute just to provide a brief overview via a short presentation that we have for our audience tuning in. So I'm going to ask Rotimi if you can share the presentation to get us started, and just so that we are grounded in some facts, and then it will allow us to really delve into an in-depth conversation once those initial facts have been laid out. So if you can, Rotimi, go to the first slide, and just really our focus for today is on the role of external actors on the circumstances in Sudan and Congo. So we're very particular about this angle because it is complex and it involves support for various parties, external economic interests, diplomatic efforts to find a resolution, but we have to really understand the multifaceted nature of their involvement in understanding the dynamics of these crises. So we have a particular lens with which to view these crises for our conversation today. Next slide. So we'll start with just a little bit of background on the current conflict in Sudan. So in April 2023, escalating violence erupted between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces. And this occurred during negotiations for a transitional government. In 2019, the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, was ousted. There was a nonviolent revolution. And what we're seeing in 2023 is an offshoot from that, or is a continuation from that. There was a power sharing deal, which was disrupted by a coup in 2021, which has led to increasing unrest. And what we'll dive into in this discussion in particular is the severe humanitarian crisis, which has left millions of people in need of assistance, including food, water, and medical aid. Next slide. So some of the key actors, we just wanted to lay them out so that as the conversation is going on, you'll have a better sense of who's who we're actually talking about. So certainly the government of Sudan, the Sudanese government is obviously one of the key actors. We have rebel groups such as the Sudan Liberation Movement. We have the international community, so we have the United Nations, and we have a graphic that we'll share that outlines, especially from a humanitarian perspective, some of what they have been helping to call attention to. Also, the African Union mission in Darfur, who were intended to protect civilians and support peace efforts. There are also regional organizations, the African Union, which is continental, the Arab League. They've been engaged in diplomatic initiatives and peace negotiations in attempts to find a resolution to the conflict. Next slide. So again, before the current conflict that we're seeing today, Sudan was already facing violence and displacement due to the Darfur crisis since 2003, so 20 years. And then again, the military coup that triggered political and economic turmoil and has reignited those conflicts. Next slide. And so this graphic was actually from the UN HRC, the Human Rights Commission, that just talks about the scale of displacement, and it shows where people are being displaced. So you can see they're going to their populations growing in Ethiopia, in Egypt, in Chad, in Central African Republic, and then elsewhere within Sudan. So internal displacement, as well as in South Sudan. So as of 2023, earlier this year, 3.3 million people have been displaced, with 2.6 million displaced within country and 738,000 fleeing to neighboring countries. Again, some of the ones that I mentioned. So estimates suggest that between 200,000 and 400,000 people have lost their lives due to violence, disease, and displacement. So again, there are multiple issues at hand, disease, displacement, in addition to violence that is being grappled with currently. Next slide. Now, as we shift to what's happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, so DRC, and the conflict there, again, our conversation today encompasses both and looks at the external factors that are influencing what's happening in both countries. So we wanted to provide a bit of background on what's happening in the DRC. So the Second Congo War, which is known also as the Great War of Africa, began in August 1998. The war officially ended in 2003, but violence has continued in many regions, in many areas in that region. So it's been ongoing since the 1990s with various phases and shifts and intensity. The conflict in Congo is fueled by competition over valuable natural resources. So we'll talk a little bit about this, including minerals like coltan, gold, and diamonds. And it's had a severe regional impact with neighboring countries. Next slide. This issue of displacement is again a major issue also in the context of DRC. So approximately 6.9 million people have been displaced since 1996, and the conflict has resulted in around 6 million deaths. So it has just been a massive, massive scale of displacement and death as a result of this conflict. Next slide. Again, just going over some of the key groups that are involved in DRC. Again, a complex set of groups. So you have the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, FDLR. You also have the Allied Democratic Forces. You have Mai militias and various ethnic militias. We also have the Congolese government forces, the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which represents the government's military presence. Again, you have the groups that were just named, the international interventions, the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC has been involved in peacekeeping efforts. And then you also have groups like M23, which is a Congolese rebel military group, primarily composed of ethnic Tutsi and operate mainly in the North Kivu region of Congo. So these are just, again, it's an overview of some of the key groups that have been involved, and we'll be talking more about those groups in the conversation. So with that, I think we've reached the end of this presentation. And again, it was really just to provide some background context for those who are tuning in so that we can make sure that the discussion is grounded with our panelists who are really going to do the deep dive. And so what I'd like to do is just turn over to our panelists, and if each of you could introduce yourselves, just a brief line. We'll start with Dr. Kahir, and then we'll go to Quscondy, and then we'll go to Dr. Baldo. If you can just share briefly your background, the organizations you represent, sort of how you show up in this work, and then from there we will dive into the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Amara. Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Eva Kahir. I'm a UK-based Sudanese medical doctor. I'm working with the University of Cambridge, as well as in my capacity as Sudanese medical diaspora, I'm part of the Sudan Doctors for Human Rights which is a professional diaspora organization based here in the UK, as well as doing some other community and grassroots activism for many, many years. I also have experience of working on the ground in Sudan in human rights and education and the third sector. And for the past few years throughout the transition period and into now, I've been involved in humanitarian analysis, human rights monitoring, and advocacy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kahir. Quscondy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Amara and team for organizing this, and welcome everyone from this panel. My name is Quscondy Abdulshafi. I am also Sudanese, and I've been working on human rights, democracy, and governance in past 10, 11 years. I work on East Africa through different organizations, including I work with Dr. Baldo as well on the Sudan Democracy First Group, and I work with the African Center for Justice and Peace Studies. Currently, I lead Freedom House work mostly on Sudan and in Africa, where we do in our international programs, we do support civil society in the continent. So we have 8 offices in Africa, including our Sudan office, which is now relocated to Nairobi. And we also do recite Freedom in the World and also Freedom on the Net, and also tracking the operation of the governments for the political opinion in the third country. So I'm mostly involved as well in our recite programming and rating every year, but mostly I work on our advocacy and programs on Sudan. And nice to meet you all. I can't wait for the discussion.
Thank you, Quscondy. Dr. Baldo.
Thank you, Dr. Amara, for having us, and thank you for our participants who are in this webinar. I'm Suliman Baldo, founding director of Sudan Transparency and Policy Tracker. Prior to that, I worked with several US-based think tanks and Sudanese civil society organizations. Relevant ones are my work for Human Rights Watch, a senior investigator on the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo during the First War of Liberation. That is the one that ousted Mobutu Sese Seko, and the second war, which was called, Africa's Great War, or Africa World War. And after that, as the director for Africa in the International Center for Transitional Justice, I also oversaw a program for transitional justice in post-conflict Democratic Republic of Congo, among other countries in Africa. This is all for the moment. I prefer leaving the time for discussing the situation that you presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're just dropping some biographical information into the chat for those who want to follow up on the work that's been done, the work that you all have been doing. And I think just to open up the discussion, we did present some of the background information, some of the facts about what's happening, but I think I wanted to open up a question for all of you, and just to talk about the level of visibility or lack thereof, and why, when we look at the numbers, for example, of displaced people, the numbers of people who have lost their lives as a result of these crises, what is your assessment or your sort of analysis as to why these crises have not are not seeming to have the level of visibility that perhaps may be warranted, or that you think is warranted? So I want to just start with that question. And Dr. Kahir, I'll go to you, and then Dr. Baldo and Quscondy, please feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Dr. Amara. In terms of visibility, when we look at the situation of sort of even bubbling conflict, even before the open conflict in Sudan, and certainly in the troubled, sort of generation, really troubled 3 decades at least in the Congo. Both of these crises are older than the Ukraine crisis, for example, but the coverage of Ukraine has been much, much greater. Indeed, a UN colleague told us that when the Ukraine appeal opened, it was filled within a day. The purse was filled, and the Sudan sort of fund in Geneva is 39% full still 8 months into the crisis. And I think when you kind of put them next to each other in that kind of way, it can give you an idea of the scale of the discrepancy. I think, for example, one of the Sudan crisis was already becoming neglected before things even heated up in Gaza and Israel. And so in terms of aid, in terms of attention, diplomatic efforts, media, and so on, that has been diverted. And it's very understandable, given the scale of that crisis, how attention and resources will see some sort of diversion. But it's there, it does beg the question, why do African crises fall to the bottom of the line? Why are they sort of forgotten about until there's nothing that interesting in the news cycle, and then they're picked up again? And I'm sorry if that's a little bit of a cynical point of view. I've heard people use worse terms to describe the kind of discrepancy there are. People do talk about, sort of racist elements to this, the fact that public, let's say Western public attention, empathy, etc., are easier to gain in other crises, the long-running one in Palestine and Ukraine, for example. But also, with the war in Ukraine, the powers that are involved and very heavily and publicly supporting Ukraine are doing so because of their own proxy relations with Putin, with Russia. And so even though, and I'm sure we'll come on to this later to talk about how Wagner and any iteration remaining of Wagner now, but certainly historically, the Wagner Group's influence on both Sudan and DRC and across the Sahel, at least, if not beyond, it's surprising that the kind of proxy relations, proxy war with Russia did not seem to take root in the same way in Sudan. And obviously nobody wants open conflict, but certainly in terms of backing aside against the influences of Moscow, that seems to be taking precedence in Ukraine, whereas it wasn't really happening in Sudan and DRC. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Quscondy, Dr. Baldo.
Yeah, thank you. It's difficult to add to what Ms. Khair just said, but I will just also point to the fact that the span of attention of the public opinion, seems to be very limited to one major crisis or two maximum at a time, and that is a factor in the little attention that major crises are getting in Africa. In addition to the fact that there is more identification and empathy with victims of this type of crisis, that are similar to us in a way, than in some distant places, very complex conflicts, difficult to decipher or understand why this so huge and why this violence. So people just in ordinary citizens in different places, shrug their shoulders and move on, that this is just too chaotic, we cannot do much about it. So it's a question of attitude also. Thanks.
Yeah, I would just add on that I think I confirm that there is different measures with regard to the crisis, and just stressing back that Congo and Sudan, these are countries that have the longest civil war, but for this year, Congo has the record ever number of the displaced people, around 7 million. This never happens in the past 30 or 40 years of the crisis. And it's the same numbers in Sudan. Sudan hit the record during all these 30 years, record displacement and humanitarian disaster ever. And I think you know, if you say a country within the 5 months or 4 months has 7 million people displaced, there is no scale describable to any scales mentioned here. And I think one of the big things that is missing within the conversation is there is no interconnected conversation within us in the continent. I think there will always be biases, and I think we have a lot. We have media, we have resources within our African continent, but we are not able to mobilize systemic mobilization for us to counter the narrative that exists. And I think this is something that really needs to be moved, at least within the continental level, or at least, you know, for us as people who are in Africa or in diaspora that work for our continent, to have some sort of collaborative work to be able to raise the visibility of this crisis. And though these crises are local, and we will be discussing this later, they are very much internationalized on other external wars that are run there. And I think exposing that and having that some sort of close solidarity on the crisis in the happening is something that is missing. And I think, you know, that is just the fact that currently, you know, you can say Sudan Congo fatigue. You know, it is real, and its consequence can be very, very difficult in the next coming 3 or 4 or 5 months if nothing have changed based on the recorded number of the crisis, but also number of the readiness for all international and regional mechanisms to respond to the magnitude of the crisis that exists.
Thank you so much for those statements. You all really bring just some incredibly important points into the discussion. So even on this point of connectedness, I know that we, particularly with Global Black, have really been in the space of trying to connect Africans and the diaspora. And it's not an easy task, but it's a necessary task. It's necessary work so that we can see ourselves in each other and at minimum empathize with the issues that are happening on the continent, even if it seems like it's so far away. And so even here, we have folks tuning in from Central and South America. We have folks in the US, we have folks on the continent, we have folks from Europe who are concerned because of that level of visibility, but recognizing our connectedness. So that's just such an incredibly important point to bring up, as well as the sheer scale of the crisis. So Quscondy, you mentioned the 7 million displaced. I mean, that's a major headline, or should be, or would be a major headline. But it also begs the question of, even within the continent, what steps can be taken even to create the level of visibility, awareness within the continent to mobilize to address the crises. So even as we are focusing on the external factors that are influencing these conflicts, there are some internal questions, at least as it relates to the continent, about how we make more visible, how we mobilize resources, how we counter the narrative, the narratives that are put out about the crises, about the countries, and about our people, which is a huge undertaking. I want to encourage those who have questions. We do have a question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. If you can use that, would be great. Also, feel free to drop your questions into the chat. And then for those who require interpretation services, we do have French and Sudanese Arabic that are available at the translation button at the bottom of the screen as well. So just kind of taking from one, the level of visibility, the level of attention in spite of the scale and scope of these crises, let's now talk about some of the external factors. I really want to take some time to unpack that a bit. So we're looking at these crises as global in scope. Can you walk us through who are some of those external actors? Who are we talking about, essentially? And I will go to Quscondy, then Dr. Baldo, and then Dr. Kahir, just to kind of, let's be clear. who, what are the external factors, and kind of connect some dots for our participants.
Thank you. And this is a complicated network and things to unpack. And just generally, Sudan Congo falls in this resource belt, but also a civil war belt that is now includes Central Africa, Chad, even part of Cameroon, Congo, and South Sudan. These are the deep African niche that have never seen political instability in the past 50 or 60 years. And why this is the most war-ridden zone, the basic thing is the resources. And who is benefiting those resources are not local community, not people who are there. In those bushes, AK-45 is cheaper and more accessible than improved seed of maize. It's very easy to wage war, mobilize people and go to war. And this is where the biggest question is, who and how is benefiting? This is the zone for the most internationalized illicit business and trade that includes mining, armed trade, and other organized crimes, but also a state-sponsored group. And this is just to bring back to, for instance, the Sudan context, and forget about the historical context of the war, but the context of the war from just last April 15 to now, which is being fought in Sudan. This conflict is a result of a complete, very complicated network of external actors that involve, particularly in the Middle East side. Emirates is very much key. Wagner is very strong key and factors. And Egypt also has a very strong influence, at least within the local context and the regional context. And why this is happening? We have Sudan Armed Forces, which is being dominating the power of the country. At least 80% of almost 90% of Sudan's independent timeline since 1965 is led by these military elites. So they are very much entrenched, institutionalized, and they are holding that power for all of this time. As the nonviolent movement is sparked, they didn't want to leave the power. But there is also other external actors. For instance, it's very good. There's a lot of illicit business that this company does, and that former regime was doing. And the military is the guard for those interests. Those interests that include security and strategic interests for Egypt, for instance. Any political change and the democratic change in Sudan will have negative impact to the military elites that are controlling power in Egypt, for instance, but also have any other geostrategic challenge for Egypt. But for the Emirates, is mostly a business, which is a key supporter for the Rapid Support Force. These are paramilitaries that are responsible for mass atrocities and genocide in 2003, reorganize it, retrain it, and reintroduce it to the state as the key actors in the security sector, formalize it and legalize it. What happened is that the Emirates and Saudi Arabia basically uses this force as a proxy wars in Yemen, but not Yemen only. The RSF is the main producer of the gold, and that start from Darfur gold in Jebel Amir. And what happened is before when the ferries, particularly the gold played a very international role because Emirates takes this gold, untax it, crude, and re-operationalize in Emirates and sell it out. What happened is that if this militia lost the legitimate power, all of these interests of the gold will be lost. And who is at risk? Emirates, but also Russia, particularly, because these forces are not only guarding the gold and mining in Sudan, but also they guard the oil fields in Libya, the same territory, meaning that the demise of RSF is the demise of interest of both these countries and these groups in not only Sudan, but also in Libya. And because of that, and why, for instance, for Russia, RSF is the key, because when Russia did the first invasion, first war a few years ago, it was very hardly sanctioned. And when they're preparing to go to new war to Ukraine, they have to de-dollarize their currency. And the alternative resources to de-dollarize is to have massive amount of gold that can be used, that is not affected by the sanction. And that RSF and all of this, the gold in Sudan and in Libya was the key for that de-dollarization effort. And that's why Wagner, Russian government, played a very strong role into supporting this, illicit business and to get as much as they can. And in exchange is very much advanced military training, military equipment that makes this force not as stronger than the state force, but they are stronger. They can threat even other neighboring countries now, become the strongest military institution, which is a very strategic threat to any peaceful democratic change, not only in Sudan, but also the neighboring country where there is ethnic, cultural, political connections like Chad and other countries. So I think it is very complex network, even beyond this layer. There are other layers of interest that I can't explain this, but these external factors are key currently, for instance, into the reignition of the conflict, and also, prevention of the peaceful democratic transition that people of Sudan fought so much hard to win it, to achieve that historical milestone. And take country hold back because people want gold, because the illicit business has to prosper even if people die. And now what's happened is the whole state apparatus is destroyed. There is a whole statelessness in the 90% of the Sudan, where there is the existence of the state mechanism, and anyone de facto or de jure power of the state does not exist. No courts, no functioning government, no school, no nothing. So we have moved from, unstable state to non-state in a span of less than 5 months. And this is where the danger looks like. What is then? What the future looks like if this situation continues in this way? It is not good. It is approximate country government. So I will hand over to please and back to you, Dr.
Yeah, so a lot shared in your statement, but really starting with the fact that these areas, the resources, so the economic impetus of the conflict, that there are significant economic interests, not only in the unrest, but in continuing the unrest, so in not resolving the issue. And just for those who are perhaps less familiar with de-dollarization, so Russia shifted away from the dollar to their own currency, the ruble. And when it comes to, from a monetary policy standpoint, your currency will need to be backed by something, right? And so in this instance, as Quscondy mentioned, gold. So having your currency backed by gold helps to facilitate the shift away from the dollar, hence the involvement of Russia and Wagner Group. And so just wanted to kind of reiterate that for those who are perhaps less familiar with that connection between the monetary shifts that are taking place and how it's actually contributing to the ongoing unrest in the region. I want to turn to Dr. Baldo to kind of get your thoughts on what Quscondy shared about the many actors that are in this space and the incentive, the perverse incentive, if you will, not only to ensure that the conflict exists and crises exist, but to continue them.
Yes, indeed. To be brief, the colonial state was focused on two major activities to hold to power. One of them, divide to rule, and the other, extraction of all resources from the colonial countries. Post-independence Africa, the countries with most resources were governed by elites in many instances that sought a similar model, whereby they capture the resources for the interest of the few, those who are in control of government at the expense of their populations. This model was what was applied in Congo by Mobutu, and the term of kleptocracy was actually coined to reflect the severe centralization of the resources of this very rich country in the hand of the ruling elite, which is President Mobutu and his entourage, and leaving the population without essential services, without infrastructure, without education and health and so on. The resources therefore became, an object of attraction for neighboring countries, and we have seen the interventions by African countries who are in better, shape. Rwanda, Uganda, occupying Eastern Congo with some rebel groups from Congo as funds for this. And the motivation here was to capture the resources of this weak country for the benefits of its most, more powerful neighbors. Coltan produced in Eastern Congo was exported from Rwanda. Jewels that were, captured from Eastern Congo were exported, and gold were exported from Uganda. And the international global economic order knew exactly where these metals came from, but it still pretended that these are exports of Congo's neighboring countries. And this is how resources stolen from Congo melded into the global economy. And therefore, there is a responsibility at the level of the global economy. The situation is similar to Sudan. All the gold that is extracted in Sudan is fueling the violence there, ends up in the United Arab Emirates, and from there, after refining it for a second time, it ends up, with European refiners such as the ones in Switzerland and so on, and being used from there into our modern technologies that need, these rare metals, coltan or gold or, cobalt for Congo, for instance, is now very essential for the emergence and the rise of electric vehicles. So Wagner Group in Sudan, in Libya, in Syria, they are after the resources. They have fighting forces in Libya, getting a percentage of the oil that they are guarding. For General Haftar in Syria, it's similar. They are protecting oil fields and oil infrastructure. In Sudan, they came in with security services, political influence services for both the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, because they were allied. And against that, they were given concessions for gold. Again, the question of resources flowing back to Russia. And you have kleptocratic forces in Sudan, a kleptocratic regime of President Omar al-Bashir, basically benefiting from these security services. The fighting forces today in Sudan are, basically at one point they were very closely allied. It was the Sudan Armed Forces that trained and equipped the Rapid Support Forces. However, having together crushed the pro-democracy movement in the country, there wasn't enough room for two kleptocratic forces, and now they are fighting, for one of them to take full control. And this is what is behind the current tragic situation that Quscondy described in regard to the cost of the war at the human level and, the humanitarian cost, but also the destruction of infrastructure and, destruction of all essential services, education, and health. All of this is obliterated today in Sudan due to this fierce competition between two kleptocrats that are fighting over power and resources in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Just some really important points that you have brought up in what you shared, particularly around the colonial element to the conflict and the fight for resources. One of the questions that we looked at when we did a previous event that was looking at the coups that have taken place on the continent is the role of militarism. And so we looked at US militarism, and we looked at the role of the French in the region. We were focused more so on the Sahel and Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, in those areas. But some of what you shared, I think, it brings to mind some really critical questions about the role of militarism in this resource competition. Can you share a little bit about some of your thinking on the role that militarism has played in this competition between countries and how it connects with the, I guess, corporate interests, if you will, or these companies that are benefiting or that are benefiting from the conflict? How does that work alongside militarism?
Basically, if you have a political elite that is capturing and privatizing the resources of the country for the inner circle of power, they need security agencies and a powerful military to protect the privatization of the resources. And this is exactly what happened in Sudan over 3 decades. The regime of deposed Bashir developed the capacity of the army to repress the population, but at the same time they were concerned that the army would rebel against them or stage a coup d'état, so they created parallel armies, and one of them is the Rapid Support Forces, which is now engaged in this fierce war with the army. And that is to say, out of concern for the continuation and survival of the regime. Foreign allies of the regime would come in and fit in with this structure of power, such as in the case of the Wagner Group and its contribution in Sudan, similar to what happened in other countries. Militarism, therefore, becomes part of an essential part in the system of capture of power. But there are other dimensions that are international to the question of militarism. For instance, with the rising threat of international extremist violent groups in the countries of Sahel, such as Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, the military establishment in the United States of America deployed military education and training programs to assist armies in this part of the continent, particularly the Sahel region, where the threat is highest, in counter-terrorism, military responses to these terrorist groups in the Sahel region. And we ended up with a situation where in several African countries, those officers who were trained under this program of counterterrorism ended up being the ones who staged coup d'etat against elected governments in their respective countries. And therefore, there are unintended consequences that point that the military response is never an adequate response to the threat of terrorism in the case of the Sahel region. And in fact, what is needed is an investment in the long-term, development and education, so that the youth are not attracted into the ranks of terrorist groups or into joining armies and become, oppressors of their own people, such as what happened in the Sahel.
That's such important context. There have been so many instances throughout history in the past, but also recent, of the United States training individuals militarily, and then those individuals becoming part of some of these groups, and not just on the continent, but also we can look to Afghanistan, we can look to other areas in the Middle East with where those have been some of the outcomes. So just that connection between militarism and expanding militarism and how it actually contributes to the unrest, contributes to the violence, contributes to the instability in the region. It's a connection that we have to make, and we have to connect those dots for people. I want to talk about the humanitarian crisis and just the scale and the scope of the humanitarian crisis, because it is unprecedented. Dr. Kahir, if you can talk from your perspective as a medical doctor, as someone who's been just deeply involved. We listed out some statistics at the beginning of this conversation around just the number of people displaced, the number of deaths, but help us to go a little bit deeper into what the humanitarian crisis looks like from your perspective, and what are some of the interventions that you and your colleagues have been working on or working through to address the humanitarian crisis?
Thank you, Dr. Amara. The humanitarian crisis, the daily, weekly sort of updates that we get through OCHA are, you can take them a little bit with a pinch of salt, certainly on, let's say, mortality data. Sort of up until now, the latest count is sort of 12,000 killed, for example. It's, the real figure is going to be much higher than that. Part of the challenge of the complete blackout for, information getting in and out very easily and communication difficulties is collecting, the numbers, collecting the figures to allow, the world to understand really what's happening and to allow the international response to mount effectively. But according to OCHA's latest figures, there are 5.4 million internally displaced Sudanese at the moment, and 1.3 million have crossed the borders and become externally displaced or refugees. The figure of sort of food insecurity at the moment is between 15 to 20 million at risk of starvation, and this is actually the season for food plenty at the moment. And the fact that this is happening now is quite concerning, because once we get into the spring, it will be a worrying time if people can't even feed themselves now. So cholera cases are in the thousands, again, according to what's being reported. The real figures may be more than the 5,000 or so that are being quoted. 70–80% of healthcare facilities are out of commission, and it may be higher than that. For example, I know of 1 or 2 hospitals still operating in Khartoum, and given the size and the population density of the capital city, that's really an incredible thing to imagine in terms of coverage, shall we say, looking at sort of Gaza-like proportions. Sort of 2/3 population don't, lack access to health facilities. And of course, we have zones of fighting. So in terms of looking at the humanitarian picture, we've kind of consider it in terms of open conflict hotspots, sort of red zones, where, like in Khartoum, in Darfur, in areas of Kordofan, where there is active fighting between the two sides, the SAF and the RSF. And then as you get further out, there are places in Sudan where it's affected by the war in terms of how certain elements of infrastructure and banking and food supplies are operating, but they're somewhat shielded from the immediate threats that are happening in the conflict area. So you've got the kind of, surrounding zones like in Jazeera State, in Wad Medani, and then, if you go further afield, it's even slightly more detached from what's going on. But they are, there is a national effect of the disruption to food supply lines and electricity communication issues and so on. One thing that came to my attention was a humanitarian call put out by the Fetihab emergency response room. And Al-Fetihab is a region, an area of Durman, and the local sort of on-the-ground responders who are very key to the localized response, in fact, are doing the majority. They're doing the lion's share of responding on the ground, through mutual aid and on the ground responding as volunteers who are in networking with each other to provide aid in terms of food, health, and so on. And the ERR for Al-Fetihab put out an emergency call, a humanitarian call, to describe the situation of a siege in El Fitihab, where the RSF and SAF are engaged in active fighting, and they're surrounded. Essentially, they can't move because if they step out of their houses, they are presumed by one side or the other to be, a sort of a hostile, and so they can be shot, killed, they can be abducted, and so on. And so, with this kind of siege situation, no food can get in, supplies, medicine, fuel, and people can't get out very easily. Things like kidnapping, forced disappearance, obviously the weaponized use of rape, sexual and gender-based violence, forced displacement wherever it suits, either side in the conflict, and of course reports of ethnic cleansing depending on where you are, and what your sort of characteristics are when you come across particularly SAF operatives. I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you so much. That's just helpful to give people a sense of what is happening on the ground. I'm curious, Dr. Baldo, from a humanitarian perspective in Congo, if you're seeing similar dynamics playing out, particularly where those who are local are having challenges being able to actually provide humanitarian aid, humanitarian assistance for any number of reasons. Are you seeing any similarities with the humanitarian crisis in the Congo, or are there different ways that it is playing out there?
Similarities and contrast. With regard to similarities, it took the situation in Congo like 2 decades to reach this horrific figure of 7 million displaced. In Sudan, the war is underway for the last 8 months, but we have already crossed the threshold of 6.5 million. This is the latest information from OCHA, by the way, Ms. Khair. So in Sudan, the violence has erupted with such intensity and so suddenly that people found themselves uprooted. The entire population of the 3 cities that constitute the capital of Sudan, Khartoum, Omdurman, and Khartoum North, it's a city tripartite capital of 7 to 10 million people. They have been displaced to areas that have been less affected by the conflict, and many, like 1.3 million, as Eva mentioned, fled to neighboring countries. In the context of Sudan, the war led to the immediate collapse of all government services, and it's knocked out more than 70–80% of health facilities. And who's responding to the crisis? Who's the frontline providers of humanitarian assistance to these displaced? It is local volunteers, youth associations that have set themselves up as emergency response rooms. This is what Eva mentioned. And I want to underscore that because volunteers, local volunteers, are responding to similarly affected populations who are less fortunate than themselves in areas where this displaced arrived. The high figures in Congo, and this is a contrast here, of people who perished as a result of the repeated successive wars there, mostly were a result from indirect causes and not direct violence. Because in conditions of displacement, populations are exposed to the elements, to epidemics that are not that are actually preventable, but they don't have access to vaccines, they don't have access to treatment, and they basically are dying by the millions because of that. And the figure of 5 million people, Congolese people who died in the conflict there is mostly an indirect cause of the conflict. And we are very concerned, since we are only 8 months in this horrific war, that we will be reaching similar figures. The figure of 12,000 that is officially cited, that the people who were civilians who were killed in this conflict, is far from the reality, because we are not counting, the agencies that are counting casualties are not counting people who died from indirect causes of this. For instance, people who suffer from conditions such as blood pressure or diabetes or all kind of coronary diseases are not finding the regular regimens of treatment, that they need. And there are many deaths among them. Most tragic also, we have seen huge tragedy with the rapid, death of people who needed kidney dialysis, for example, due to the failure to provide them with the regular products that they need for this weekly treatment. So that's what's going on in Sudan today. And if there is anything that is alleviating the suffering, it's these volunteers, young people across Sudan who are, and the local communities, host communities, who are helping others who fled and took refuge in their neighborhoods.
Just emphasizing again that it is people who are in their local communities, particularly young people, who are doing that organizing work on the ground, trying to address and mitigate the humanitarian crisis. And so the challenges around delivering those humanitarian services are just really, really significant, because they are the ones that are the closest to the crisis. We've dropped into the chat just some links for those who are following and want to get more information. Dr. Baldo with the Sudan Policy and Transparency Tracker. I think we have that link in the chat, but we can drop it in again, as well as we have some information from Shabaka.org, which maps out the situation in Sudan. We also have the Sudan Crisis Coordinating Unit, a link where you can just read more about these humanitarian efforts, some of the challenges. We had a question that I think is a really important question. There's a question about leadership and whether or not the leadership in these different countries, whether they are the culprits and essentially what role they have to play. And so the question I want to ask to all of you, and we'll start with you, Quscondy, is on this question of leadership. What is the role of leadership? And we'll just start with the leaders in the countries in question. What is their role and responsibility in addressing the crisis from your perspective? And we can also talk about culpability, but responsibility in addressing the crisis.
Yes, and thank you so much for the question. I think, and this just taking us back to what Dr. Baldo said. So how our states came into existence. They came in existence as part of the colonial process. We didn't have our independent nation-building, nation-making process. And because the way the states came in or created, the states in Africa did not create it to be people's state. The states created to respond to the colonial needs. And because of that, the relationship between normal citizen population and the state was from the beginning hostile relationship. That hostile relationship, either tax collection, either that hunting of the slaves, or either that extraction of resource or land grabbing. That was the establishment of the relationship between the state system and the local communities and population. And the problem is that after the independence, the birth of the modern African independent state, or quote unquote independent state, which is completely contestable term, the elite were not able to transform those relationships to a positive relationship, meaning that they try to keep the same relationship because it keeps that hierarchical relationship, and they created a class. Either that is complete ethnocentric elitism, like in Sudan, combining Arabization and Islamization, and put that as a parameter for a ticket to get into zone of it. And then we created an state that, for instance, is not representative, but also a state that is structured in a way that it has to be oppressive to exist. Meaning that the concept of the citizenship as an individual does not exist. Our political parties and governance systems, all of them are emerged as expansive picture of tribal existence. And because of that, the one thing that people, if the state does not exist, people always create alternative institutions to affiliate to. In country like Sudan, tribes were alternative institutions. Even in our early elections, tribal leader or religious sect leader can determine where people to vote and how to vote. So we were not able to create a transformative institutions. And as a result, we did not, our institution cannot create type of leaders that can be representative or that can lead people with integrity, because that is not how the state operations are created. And lack of transformative politics, it is what created our unstable state. Greedy leaders, they have to be oppressive to dominate the power. So you have thieves, you have to bring many thieves around you, and then you have to have a big gun so you can silence others to stay at the power as much as you can. And then you have to use the same colonial tactics, so divide people and rule it. And that is the same modality in Congo. Even in some countries where there is elites, you will see, even if it is not ethnic, you will see elites, when they got into the power, they then marry each other and they create a new classes of their sons and daughters. And that is where, it can be connected to the vast military coup that is happening in the West Africa. This is also some sort of discontent, because for all of these years, these elites made so difficult to make any development, made so difficult to fight poverty, but also made so difficult for any change. Because as they start opening schools for other kids to go to school, their kids are already in London, somewhere learning. So when they come back, these cannot compete them. Military institution, you just need to be 18 years old and have a physically well, and you just go there and become. So military institutions become more representative than our political parties, or very much elitized or intellectualized civil society and political and party systems. So I think, if we are trying to kind of, view this particularly, the instability that happens, it is why it's so easy for a political leader to go, and create a strategic partnership with very organized criminal non-state actor like Wagner, for instance, to extract a gold and get it as a crude, to take it in a third country, and destroy not the environment, but also buying instead of building on a road, buying the biggest gun possible. Why this kind of thinking exists? This kind of thinking exists because of the way the state is structured. You need to have power. You need to have a military might to be in power. The easy way of being accepted by the people and voted and elected, it is not the way that state operates. That is a difficult way. And I think unless, I think we are able to build, more powerful or empowered people at the local level institutions, this exploitation will continue. So meaning that the external actors already have their clients here, and these clients are ready for service anytime they need it. Unless there has to be some systems interruption. And that is where, like what Dr. Suliman telling us, of the youth group that say, okay, there is no state, there is no safe for international NGOs. We are coming to serve our people, risk ourselves, dying every day. And that is where the African spirit of solidarity and people's connection begins. And I think we really need to rethink about our state as an apparatus for unifying us. Not only our state, but also our inherited political party, both oppositions and those leading. All of them buying a story that is over after the departure of the colony, but they are selling that story in a different way to us. And I think that is where this conversation at the intellectual level need to happen, to revisit, to rethink about the state apparatus in Africa, to rethink about how do we make a state more inclusive. like as a countries, we're able to create some sort of pseudo-democracy governance, some way that creates some collective action to build the state that serves people and represents people and move forward, while we are still going back, fighting, at tribal lines and having big armies, very easy for one man to go and mobilize 100 people to carry guns. But one peace builder cannot mobilize 20 people in one place to sit and discuss about peace building. Even they give them a t-shirt and give them food and per diem. Why this is so easy and why that is so easy and why this is so difficult? Because that is how the society is structured. So this is the biggest question, and we have to answer this question internally. If we don't answer this internally, we will still continue our states being tools. We will still being a resource land where everyone in anywhere tomorrow can come in and exploit us and take us to war and conflict with nonsense and very heavy humanitarian disasters.
I appreciate so much, Quscondy, you're bringing up the question of the state and the legitimacy of the state, which continues to be at issue on the continent, in Africa in general, because of the origins of how these states were created. At their origins, they were created, whether the boundaries, the groups that were put together versus not, at the convenience and for the benefit of colonial entities, and the impact of that still reverberates today. And it's important, and this is why I appreciate your comments so much. It's important to understand that context, that the very creation, the very nature of how states were created on the continent was never for the interests of the people, was never with consideration of what the people need, was not created with the worldview and the cultural norms of the people in that area. It was created for the purposes of profit and exploitation. And we're still seeing the impacts of that today in these ongoing crises. Just on some of what you named around the ways that we work around that and this notion of solidarity. Dr. Kahir, I wanted to turn to you just along those same lines, just for the last few minutes that we have, to really talk about what are some of the interventions? How do we build the kind of Pan-African solidarity that can help us navigate this? What are some of the things that, or as far as calls to action for those who are in civil society, for those who are on the continent, for those who are in the diaspora, that individuals can hold on to or can take with them as they seek to get more information about what is happening, or perhaps to get involved?
Thank you. I think, the humanitarian situation at the moment is obviously a combination of economic and political factors, as well as armed conflicts. But from the humanitarian side, which is, the political processes will happen. Some people are more involved in them and not. Some things are happening on the diplomatic stage, the world stage, very openly. Some things are happening behind closed doors. And so I think the people that I know sort of professionally in the network, but also on the diaspora and on the society level, sort of, grassroots and community level, people take to task what they can. They use the tools that are available to them. And so the humanitarian challenges of access, international organizations can't get in, we can't get that kind of money in officially, and there are issues there and conversations to be had about localization and how do you actually get money into Sudan to support frontline workers who are there, who are not international NGOs, and that's a whole conversation. As well, so just kind of access funding, how do you liquidate that? And also the attention, as we spoke about at the beginning. And so, you've got sort of Sudan level, regional, international efforts. So, we know that the ERRs, civil society organizations, women's co-ops, and so on, national NGOs are on the ground doing what they can. Some people have obviously left, some people have perished in this conflict, but there are, mechanisms that are in place that are operating, and people from the ERRs, when you speak with them, the sort of the trauma that they're experiencing, the level of hardship, the weight, the burden of the work, and they won't tell you that it's a burden, but you in the lack of sleep, in the trauma they've experienced, you can see the toll that it's taking. And remember, they're doing this for free while money is sitting outside in banks.
Can you elaborate on ERR just for those who are
Of course. Of course. Sorry. So the ERRs are emergency response rooms in English, and they're basically a kind of reincarnation of the resistance committees that we saw active in the revolution period, and then sort of later sort of kind of militarized to neighborhood committees. But essentially it's voluntary youth networks predominantly that basically brought forward the revolution, were very instrumental in keeping people at the posts, providing food, water, keeping people's spirits up, taking people to medical care when necessary, buttressing neighborhood kind of brigades and the watch and barricades. So they were very, very instrumental in the revolution itself. And one thing we haven't really talked about is how the army came and the RSF essentially operated their first coup on June 3rd, 2019. So Bashir fell with the first coup of the army. And then we had a second coup in 2021. And, we all saw the writing was on the wall, then we would get to here, when they would then want to eliminate each other and have all the power in their own hands. But in terms of sort of solidarity, I think there are cultural things that need to happen, as well as political processes that can be engaged. And so, from, let's say, a cultural point of view, I think speaking as, an African, speaking as somebody looking at Africa as a whole, we have issues with gerontocracy. Our cultures are very gerontocratic. We have issues of West is best. We have issues of our kind of colonial trauma. We have issues where the intelligentsia and a Western education and speaking English or French or Portuguese or whatever, even Arabic, make an impression. And so the elites maintain their stronghold in that way. Within Sudan's context, the youth, let's say the people who are alive now and who are running these response rooms and who will be the ones that inherit Sudan, these people had their education destroyed over 30 years in Bashir's era, defunded, opportunity taken away by Arabization, which also didn't help their connection to the outside world. And so, when you have, and also no civic education, civic space was completely minimalized, harassed, destroyed, with sort of the kind of vilifying of activism and the assault and the harassment and the rape of activists. And so essentially you've got people who are on the ground, young, saying, this is my country, I'm going to fight for it. Some people will leave, some people can't leave, but whoever is left is going to do their utmost. And one member of an ERR said to me, we had one member of our team who was shot dead simply for trying to get somebody assistance with food or fuel. And you'd think that everybody would shy away and get scared, but actually we got more volunteers the next day. And I think that is something key to remember, that while many of us in diaspora are outside and would bid to take power and to be instrumental in the process of governing and to kind of move those conversations and be part of the diplomatic efforts, we have people who are exercising this kind of courage. And it is for us to make space. We have to afford them that space. We have to look at our culture. We have to address the positive and not so positive aspects of tribalism and religious identity that can get in the way. So just quickly, in terms of what people can do on the ground and, political processes, whatever's in your hands, we started with writing to our members of parliament. We engage with the all-party parliamentary groups, which we have in the UK. There's one specifically dedicated to Sudan and South Sudan. We go there, we meet parliament and people from the House of Lords, and we advocate for what's going on. We tell the stories, we keep it on the agenda, and then those questions go to prime minister's questions and they go to parliament. We had the king meeting members of our civil society, King Charles III, sort of earlier in the year. And that's another avenue of sort of advocacy, raising the agenda at the all-party parliamentary group for women, peace and security. So using every platform to talk about what's happening in all the areas of conflict. And then, beyond that, people are, making their own donations with all of the international money still tied up in banks in Switzerland and wherever, and international organizations and donors being unable to increase their appetite for risk sharing and sharing, that sort of the logistics of how to get that money out and into local responders' hands. The community is simply raising funds as it can. And so you've got the, American organizations, the Sudanese American Medical Association, the Sudanese American Physicians Association, and for example, the Sudan Doctors Union in the UK are some of the organizations in this space. And I was just, if people want to donate money, it's just a case of typing, donate to Sudan, and you'll get loads of options that come up. Some of them are the big agencies, the UN agencies and so on, but many of them are grassroots and sort of civil society organizations. And I would have to say from personal experience, that is who is getting the money in. So if I was going to commit my money to something, it would be a sort of more local organization, because that money will go in. It won't sit in a bank somewhere until we all work out how to do localization. I think, talk to your children. Somebody asked a question. I agree. I think as Africans, as people in the diaspora, migration journey, depending on whether you made it or your parents did or whatever, there's a lot of trauma there. There's a lot to reckon with, but we have to start those conversations. We have to have those conversations, looking at the past, how things came to be and how things are and how they'll be in the future. And I think it's very important to talk to our children, our communities, our co-workers, our students, whatever platform you have. Talk about your experience, personalize it, say what's going on, what you see for Sudan, what you see for the Congo, and for back home, as it were. But also, use the resources at your hands. Tweet about it, follow stories. Social media, we have some very active Sudanese people, especially people like Yasmin Abdel-Majid, who's a broadcaster, who are always telling stories about it. And so I think what I would like us to do now as a community in the diaspora is not just to present the hard facts and the data and to enter panels and engage in education and advocacy, but also to switch gears a little bit and do some storytelling. Engage people's hearts and minds, as well as, using the data to advocate as to why. When the Syrian crisis happened, and certainly when the Ukraine crisis broke out, there was a lot in the media of, these are blue-eyed people like us. And I think there is a lot of work to do in advocacy to humanize what's happening to Africans and to people in Africa. And I think as in the diaspora, our role is massive and can be very beneficial in connecting the two and in helping to advocate with government here, because they do have a role to play. They do have a colonial history. They do have involvement in the past decades with arming and funding the belligerents in one way or another, working with them, doing deals. And so we can play that card. The card that's in your hand, use that. I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I would ask, because we want to, after this event, we do want to share out important information. We'll be sending email communication out to everyone. Would love to be able to include some of the links, particularly to the local grassroots organizations that people can donate to, so that they can have that direct connection, and if they are so moved, can take those next steps to support those organizations on ground. I think it's unbelievable, but we're already at time. I just had a last question and wanted to pose to each of you, really just for some final thoughts. We'll start with Dr. Baldo. Just the last question as we think about the next steps from here, and as you think about your work, what thoughts or what are the things that should be left to our listeners to take away from this conversation, and as you contemplate where things are headed, both in Sudan and in Congo?
Briefly, what Dr. Eva just mentioned reminds me that nature abhors vacuum. And therefore, in instances of massive failures of leadership, you have situations that are of governance without government. You have local communities, local volunteers stepping in, taking control of things, of servicing their own people, saving them from much hardships and so on. So Eva gave the details of all that is happening in the context of the current war in Sudan. One thing she didn't mention is that the Doctors Association of Sudanese British doctors in the UK and the Sudanese American doctors in the US and Canada are also providing remote training to their peers in Sudan on trauma surgery via links like Zoom or Google Link and so on. So this is the kind of thing, and of course they are the main conduit for donations from this association by their members and members of the public to support emergency response rooms and interventions by volunteers on the ground. Congo has a similar experience. It's local associations of civil society organizations and community associations and the Congolese churches that have sustained education, health, community development in Congo during decades of massive theft of public resources by the rulers. And therefore, you go to a place like Butembo, as I did, in 2000, and they were, local business leaders who have established their own course, their own banking system. You could open a letter of credit in Butembo, in Eastern Congo. This is a trading community, to bring goods from Hong Kong or Dubai, and that capacity, Kinshasa didn't have it. The national capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo, had a failed banking system, and it could not open letters of credit from the capital of Congo. Therefore, all the goods from the rest of the world came through Eastern Congo to the rest of the country. And the same is true in other communities. I went to places where universities funded by churches and local communities in Congo had academic correspondent relationships with the kind of, the human rights program at Harvard or Italian universities, depending on the particular, denomination of the church and the history of its relations and so on. So we should not look at this as really a black and white situation. Where governments fail, the populations take things in their own hands and, basically respond to this kind of situations until one day when we have good governance, Africa would be uplifted. But particularly countries that are suffering from these massive disasters as bad governments, lead to. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Quscondy, final thoughts from your perspective. I think you're still on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I think just in short, I think we need for us at the continent level to try to be more engaging with our disasters within the continent. And this is important because it is very disappointing the positions our governments take with regard to these conflicts in the international forums like UN. If you see when the atrocity in Darfur reached in a very, very, very dangerous way, and the Darfur case was, Sudan case was put in the UN Human Rights Council for further investigations. All the European countries and other countries really stood with the Sudanese people, but our African governments were very disappointed. They either did vote against because maybe Emirates or other countries told them what to do, or just made silent. And I think this is because I think we really need to have more coordination with regard to, our own African continental or global advocacy to really monitor what our government's doing with the powers they have, even if it is limited. It's really very disappointing. So I think something that I think for all the audience here, wherever you are, these conflicts are not in Congo, not in Sudan. These are conflicts that affect any one of us everywhere. Please take this serious, take it personal, advocate, ask, find out, talk to, and raise awareness. And I think, you know, this is what we are missing. We are so much connected to other continents than we are internally. And I think we need to break these boundaries and having more internal connections to monitor whatever our governments, the bad ones or whatever. I think to have some sort of consistent push with regard to the bad things that are happening in the region where our people are suffering. So I think for me, I would just a call of cautious for everyone. Please, you know, engage. Please, you know, advocate. It doesn't have to be money. It can be a live Facebook video. Ask your government that this is happening. What are you doing? Anything that you have in your power with the technology is very much easy. So I think that is something that is very important for us. Nothing will be changed unless we are able to move and demand for that change. Over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Kahir, final thoughts.
Thank you. The first thing I wanted to say is, you know, thank you for raising the discussion. And I'm really grateful to the Global Black team for actually providing a space to talk about the Sudan conflict and regionalize us in the African context, because I find that Sudan is always regionalized to MENA, of course, partly because of these external powers that are in play, but also because of sort of Islamic predominant religion and linguistically sort of the Arabic language. And I think Sudan somewhat falls in the cracks in that, you know, the sort of the Arab world may look at this as, oh, that African country that speaks Arabic, and, you know, from the African side, we're maybe not quite African enough. And I think there is some building to do there, some relationship building, and probably repair as well, depending on what the relationships have been. So I thank you for regionalizing that. We must look at South Sudan and Sahelian politics and as to how, you know, addressing the causes and the drivers as well. And, you know, Dr. Suliman, exactly as, you know, we could talk for hours on the diaspora and the diaspora development leading to diaspora humanitarianism. And I'm a big advocate of the recognition of the contributions of diaspora, which is done for over decades, voluntarily, in spare time, in snatched moments, in between full-time jobs and realities and you know, sort of experiences in wherever the host home is. And this is actually what has allowed diaspora to move so quickly, in the sense that those, you know, pipelines were already established, money-wise, time-wise. We already had, you know, the people say the diaspora is the largest NGO, and I have never seen as excellent an example of that as this current conflict. And that's how we can get money in, and that's how we can provide the mental support. And it's not just remote training to provide vascular surgery. And I've heard stories of cesarean sections done by phone light and a WhatsApp call with a consultant obstetrician in another country, in the West somewhere. It's also not just for professionals, you know, ordinary Sudanese, you know, whatever they have, they've tried to give to Sudan. And in this moment, they have really scaled that up, just because of their link and their sense of duty. So I would just say, anybody in the diaspora watching, advocate for your position, use your position as we do in the UK Sudan Advocacy Group and our partner US Sudan Advocacy Group. We use those channels to talk to each other as any organized, you know, NGO or international apparatus would. Use those channels to talk to each other, to build on each other's work. Don't work in silos. And, you know, hopefully we can build for a better tomorrow, if today is a little bit weird and not very comforting.
Thank you so much. We will try to keep some optimism for the today, and see what we can do in this moment. But I just want to express my deepest gratitude for all of you as panelists. Again, we had Dr. Eva Kahir, who's a medical doctor and humanitarian from Sudan. We also had Dr. Suliman Baldo, founding director of Sudan Transparency and Policy Tracker, and Quscondy Abdulshafi, who's the senior regional advisor for Africa for Freedom House. Thank you so much for taking the time to engage in this conversation. We know that the holidays are around the corner, but we felt that it was just so important to help to create visibility around both what's happening in Sudan and Congo. And I wanted to share for all of the people who tuned in and those who will watch the recording afterward, that this is ongoing work, that we certainly have plans, particularly as we head into the new year, for additional events, additional activities, additional activations, additional advocacy. For those of you who are tuning in, to be on the lookout for communications from all of us on ways that you can learn more, get involved, and get engaged. We see this as ongoing work, particularly around the need for us to build our relationships, even internally on the continent, to build and connect more so that we have that continental solidarity, and of course, our solidarity with our people around the world. So wherever we are, building those relationships so that we can actually work together. First, we have to see each other. That's the first step. We have to see each other. We have to know that we exist, and then we can start to build together. And that is ongoing work. So we are excited. Our team, the Global Black team, is excited to collaborate with all of you. We already have some ideas on the horizon that we're looking forward to working with you and supporting you in this ongoing work. And we encourage everyone who has been able to watch or participate in this event to share the recording. We will share it back with links to some of the information that you've heard, as well as some additional information on the calls to action and previews of what will be coming in the new year. And so even as a start, you can take the step of just sharing the recording, sharing the message of what you've heard, checking out the organizations that our panelists represent, and starting with ourselves, right? So sometimes it's just the steps that we take internally, whether on social media, in our networks, with our families, to be in solidarity with our people, especially in these times of crisis. So with that, I want to thank all of you, the panelists, again, for joining us. I also want to thank everyone who joined the discussion, the questions. I want to thank the Global Black team. I want to thank our interpreters as well, who interpreted this conversation in French and Sudanese Arabic. Your work makes this work possible. And so we so much appreciate that. So thank you, and we look forward to engaging with all of you in the new year and doing some work together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Dr. Amara. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
My friend, go come out to the log when they are.